Welcome everyone to this latest ISDP webinar. My name is Julian Tucker, as you can see on your screens, and I am a research fellow at ISDP's Stockholm China Center. Today's webinar is part of a series of three. 2 weeks ago, we had our first webinar in this series, which we have recorded and is available on our YouTube channel. This webinar will also be recorded and put on our YouTube channel. So if you didn't get a chance, I recommend you check out our first webinar. And of course, if you have to leave early, you can always follow up with this webinar. But please stay until the end if you can, ask questions and engage with our wonderful speakers. These webinars are part of a larger project that ISDP has been doing together with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the goal of which is to produce a report, a general, readable, and dare I say, succinct reports detailing different aspects in Sino-Nordic relations, as well as hosting these three webinars that are available to the public. Today's webinar will focus a little bit on economic, cultural, and social aspects of Sino-Nordic relations. And we have with us 5 wonderful speakers who are each going to give a brief presentation. Then, as the moderator, I'm going to direct a little bit of discussion between our discussants and bring up some of my own moderator questions. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session. Please use the question and answer function that you see on your screens. And then I will direct those towards the speakers. So without further ado, let me introduce our 5 great speakers. First off is Bengt Jonsson, who is the founder of New Context AB and an adjunct professor at Shanghai University's MBA Center. He has a lot of experience of Sino-Nordic relations, holding various positions in the Swedish Foreign Ministry, including serving as minister at the Swedish Embassy in Beijing, consul general in Shanghai, and ambassador for CSR at the Foreign Ministry. Then we have Dr. Yang Jiang, who is a senior researcher at DIS, the Danish Institute of International Studies. And she focuses on the contemporary political economy of China, as well as engaging with the domestic politics of economic reform, economic diplomacy, and outward investment. Her current research project includes Chinese development of financial institutions and breakthroughs in China's economic reform. Then we have Kristina Sandklef, an independent China analyst who runs her own consultancy company, Sandklef Asia Insights. She holds a degree from Lund University and has a minor in development studies, political science and economics. I'm sorry if I don't do you all justice. You can fill in any gaps that I leave out in your CVs, but Kristina has also worked with Ericsson and with the Swedish Armed Forces. David Macke joins us from Berlin today, where he is the desk officer for China at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. He studied East Asian studies at the University of Bochum and at the University of Tübingen, and is focused on China and Taiwan in his studies. And finally, we have ISDP's own Torbjörn Lundén, who is the head of ISDP's Stockholm China Center, has a lot of experience with China as well, having served from 1973 to 1976 as the cultural attaché at the Swedish Embassy in Beijing, has served as a research fellow at the City University in Hong Kong from 2003 to 2004, and is currently a member of the Royal Swedish Academy of Letters, as well as working at ISDP. So without further ado, I will pass the word to Bengt, and then we will go through the speakers one by one. So Bengt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear now, the microphone is working. I will talk about how CSR and Scandinavian management come into the picture of Swedish and Nordic economic relations with China. And it might be perceived as a bit trivial to talk about CSR when so many fundamental things are at stake right now. But it is necessary sometimes to talk about the individual parts to see the whole picture. You have certainly heard that many leading companies in the world, they proclaim that sustainability is a part of their biggest concern. And another concern is, of course, to have a presence in the Chinese market. And let me start then by CSR. I arranged a lot of CSR activities when I was Swedish Consul General in Shanghai from 2008 to 2012. But I really only learned what CSR was about when I, after that, was appointed Sweden's CSR ambassador from 2012 to 2015. And during that work, which mainly was about talks with the EU, with the United Nations or UN agencies and the other institutions, the OECD, for example, I understood that the Swedish experience was not that unique. The main CSR focal points in the words are, first of all, the OECD, which has issued the general recommendations and has the oldest CSR policy. And then, of course, United Nations, where, of course, all countries in the world are members, and their CSR flagship is called Global Compact. And there you are a member, and Sweden has currently 400 plus companies as members, and China has currently 500 plus companies as members. And the third important institution is GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and that is the leading standard-setting institution for CSR reporting. And during my time in the Swedish government, we used the term CSR, as China did, and a lot of other countries did. But my successor as CSR ambassador had to write a report to the Swedish Parliament about our practice of CSR. And when you write to Parliament, you are not allowed to use English words. So we then switched to the Swedish word hållbarhet or sustainability. And today, actually, hardly anybody in Sweden uses the term CSR as sustainability, which in the beginning was seen as a bit focusing on the environment. But the climate crisis, of course, indicates this is not so bad. And it should also then be pointed out that CSR from its birth was about companies' own efforts beyond legislation. Many of these issues have now been included in the legislation. And so what the companies do today is how to figure out how to abide by the new laws. And this activity is called compliance. And this trade is, of course, also important in China. We have a long-standing cooperation agreement with China on CSR. It was started in 2007. It should be added that also the other Nordic countries have a high CSR profile. And if you look at lists of the most sustainable corporations published by the Canadian institution, the Corporate Knights, you'll find, for example, both the Danish, such as Vestas and the electricity distributor Ørsted. You find Norwegians, such as Storebrand, and Finnish companies, such as Metso, among the top 20 companies. I understood more about the Chinese view on CSR when I taught this subject at the Shanghai University. I had started in 2015, and we had a class of some 50 to 60 students doing the executive MBA course over 2 years, with classes every Saturday and Sunday. When I started, I saw statistics that these students had, at an average, 8 years of professional activity in companies. I had every year 40 hours of teaching, and I was also responsible for the curriculum and the grading. And as the university practiced forced ranking with the requirement of only letting 95% pass, and students could fail 2 classes but not more, there was an enormous pressure to grade the students correctly, as tuition for them was very expensive. I had therefore to think hard how much of CSR issues they really understood and could apply in their work. And the job is rather unique, as CSR has many sensitive components such as free trade unions, business and human rights, and anti-corruption. I noticed quite from the start that the Chinese students in the university have a habit of questioning arguments, quite different from the company or official participants that I was used to have as guests. And as I had a large group, I could also make some statistical comparisons and find out how the view of CSR changed over time. CSR is about relating to views from stakeholders. In the Western world, CSR is about companies adjusting to comments they get from employees, media, NGOs. In China, more and more corporate social responsibility is how companies could adjust to policies sent out by the state and the party. This is completely different, of course, to how we look at things. But the term corporate social responsibility can be used in both situations, as the term social and stakeholders represent a variety of interests. A company's responsibility is today defined as responsibility for effects of their final products. A study of 50 large companies shows that only 6% of the final value was own production, and 94% of the value came from deliveries from the supply chain. A modern Western company, therefore, has to describe environmental and other effects within the supply chain. For companies sourcing in China, they cannot argue that supply chain in China is impossible to study. I took part in the launching ceremony of the new GRI Universal Standards last week. The GRI modernizes its standards or recommendations, as they used to be called, roughly every 5th year. It was quite clear that the trend is to dig deeper into the supply chain and report the findings publicly. This trend is contrarian to the PRC trend to argue that only China can control what happens inside China's borders. And the most likely result of this is a decoupling of the Chinese economy from the outside world. Let me mention 2 issues that are frequently discussed. One is whether China will be CO2 neutral by 2060, as they have planned, and if the EU will be CO2 neutral by 2050. If one wants to have an updated understanding, one should look at the site Climate Action Tracker. It is Climate Action Tracker in one word, .org. And you will find that neither China nor the EU will fulfill these goals. The EU is rather close, but China is way behind. The second is the EU-China Investment Agreement, CAI, where there is a statement that China plans to join the 2 ILO conventions against forced labor, that is number 29 and number 105. We know that many countries have failed to ratify all 8 fundamental conventions. Actually, 56 of all 179 members have failed. China is therefore has not ratified the 2 conventions I mentioned, and neither the 2 conventions concerning trade unions. The EU had similar problems with South Korea and Vietnam, but in these cases, they succeeded to have the ILO conventions ratified. We do not know if the tactics of the EU to enter into an agreement first without not knowing if and when China will ratify will work. And now the whole decision process, as you know, has been halted after China issued a list of sanctions. Let me then add one point here. My university decided 2 years ago to change the headline from CSR to business ethics. As I've not handled ethics, I had to study this. Ethics is a set of rules that is not based on law, but a given fact. We have our views here in our countries for what is right and wrong. Other countries think differently. You cannot say that one is right and one is wrong. And now I want to show a slide here, and this is the word value survey. If somebody can put up this slide.
Emilia, can you? Ah, yes.
Yeah, and here you see it. And you can see here that Sweden is in the upper right corner. Next to us are Norway and Denmark. And towards the center, you will find Finland. And also further down towards the Anglo-Saxon word Iceland. So the Nordic 5 countries are all in the upper right. And right means here self-expression. You can call it individualism if you like. The left side is a bit more survival. That is, you put the survival of your country or your group first. The upper side shows the rational values, secular values. The lowest are the traditional values. Now you can find China here in the Confucian bloc, and here it is the brown area. It's a bit away from Scandinavian countries, but this varies. This is the 6th update that was 2015, and we expect a new update next year. So what this means, I told my Chinese students, neither of these positions are right or wrong. They are just different. For example, if you take the family relation to your family, in the upper right, then you feel you have no obligations towards your family. You are individual. And on the left side and the lower side, the family or the clan, that is to whom you have loyalty. And even if we think there is good reasons for our position, you cannot say that somebody is more right or more wrong than the others. We are just different. And this is important to have as a basic understanding why we, for example, have different legislation on anti-corruption and things like that. In some countries, we think punishment has to be hard. In other countries, we think we use another way. And now, so this is the end thing I ended up with the last time I had Chinese students. And now during pandemic, of course, nobody can travel to China. So I think perhaps China will develop more of its own methods. And I am, and as also other Swedish companies, slightly losing a bit contact of what is happening right now. I also wanted to mention finally about Scandinavian management. And then maybe we can take away this slide because this is a new issue. We had, when I was Consul General, lots of activities about Scandinavian management. I was hesitant because I think there is no such thing as Scandinavian management. Business management, you read in Harvard Business Review, period. I understand, however, that there are these values, as I've shown on the slide before, and that Swedish companies and Nordic companies behave a bit different than others. But it is not that we have another business model. It is just that our basic values perhaps shine through this, and working in a Swedish company is a little different than working in other companies. That concludes my intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bengt, for a very interesting discussion. That was climateactiontracker.org for anybody who's interested. Feel free to check out the website. Next, we have Dr. Yang, who's going to speak a little bit about Chinese mining in the Nordic region, as well as China's domestic economic reforms. Dr. Yang, the floor is yours.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thanks very much to ISDP for the invitation. I will talk more zoomed in on a piece of land, Greenland, and not on the broad issues. And it's mainly about Chinese invested mining projects in Greenland. They are important for Denmark and for the US because Greenland has strategic values for Denmark as for its status in foreign affairs. Otherwise, Denmark doesn't count much. And for the US, Greenland hosts a US Thule Navy base that is a very important part of its global missile system. And it was increased with ice melting and increased Chinese business or shipping activities in the Arctic and in Greenland. The US is getting more and more worried. I have met with a couple of US diplomats, and they're all wondering about Chinese activities in Greenland and relations. And among Chinese activities in shipping, investment, and science explorations, investment is the most contentious because it has, been most active. And there people feel that it's easier for China to grab the natural resources in Greenland with its abundant capital. China could put Greenland into a debt trap so that China can exert political influence later or support Greenland's independence from Denmark, which is most of Greenlanders want, and therefore become an ally with China. But behind these views are the assumption that Chinese investments in Greenland are coordinated and initiated a lot by the Chinese government, the state, with strategic purposes and very coordinated. But there is not so much specific studies of the projects. My talk is based on a report that I have just written. It will come out from DIS if you want more details. So basically, there are 5 mining projects that Chinese companies have engaged themselves in substantially, and just in short, they have not borne much fruit. And actually, they are either failed or suspended because of financial risks, because of political uncertainties. So in the future, Chinese either government or business will be more cautious. I will give you some details, not so much about each of the projects, about how Chinese got in, why they would want to come to Greenland, what's the process so far of the project, and how much the Chinese government or state actors and state banks have participated in the projects. Next slide, please. Yeah, but this is just to give an idea, perspective that Denmark is much smaller than Greenland. Greenland is closer to the US. It's very important for its strategic purposes. And China is planning some shipping routes. And in China's 2018 white paper for the Arctic, it also mentioned itself as a near Arctic state and wants to build polar road up in the north. And that caused worries in Denmark and in the US. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk about some airport projects, but only mining, because there China didn't have a chance. A big Chinese state-owned enterprise, CCCC, was bidding for financing and building 3 airports or renovating some of them. But US Defense Secretary at that time under Trump told Danish defense minister about their worries, and there shouldn't be a threat to US strategic interests there. And the defense sector, intelligence sectors in Denmark was also saying that there's no game for China to play there, and Denmark doesn't want to be caught in a cat and mouse game between great powers in this. So basically, Denmark offered to finance the project or co-finance the project. The US promised to finance small projects for economic development in Greenland. So the company could still bid for contracting work, but it withdrew because of it could foresee political troubles. Next slide, please. So 4 projects from north to south. At the place of Sitoten, there is a basic metal zinc lead mine. China got in when a state-owned enterprise, also very big one, NFC, Non-Ferrous Metal Corporation, signed a memorandum of understanding with the license holder, an Australian company, Ironbark. You find a lot of Australian companies in Greenland, Arctic, because they're very good at mining. And they seem quite autonomous, even when Australian government and Chinese government are not on good terms. They're still building cooperation with Chinese companies. So there was this MOU, and the Australian company was also hoping that the Chinese metal giant would bring in financing from banks, but not much has happened since then, with metal prices dropping and uncertain financial markets. And instead, in 2020, US Export and Import Bank came with an offer to finance. So instead, Ironbark applied for loans there. And given that the US Exim is a federal sort of government bank, and they won't leave much chance for China to take a significant role in that project. And that one is the closest to completion with all the permissions obtained. Next project. Wagner copper site. This is also a project in many years in developing. They all take a long year, and starting from Western metal giants, it was previously owned by a London-based company called Nordic Mining, and a private company from Jiangxi province, also a copper province in China, Jiangxi. They signed an agreement with Nordic Mining, where Nordic Mining was looking for investors. It had a lot of troubles. So, in the domestic competition, fierce competition and increased regulation over environmental standards, quality and capacity in China, it seems some Chinese companies, especially those provincial companies and private companies, are looking for overseas resources. So they got this. The Jiangxi government was very excited, and somehow a couple of years later, this private company formed a mixed ownership enterprise with a big copper company. It's one of the biggest in the world, even though it's provincial SOE. And thus SOE got access, but basically license expired in 2019 and went to an Australian company. And during the process, China also strengthened screening of foreign investments and become more cautious averse. Next. Iswa iron ore mine. It was another company, London Mining, but a private company bought the license in 2015 when that company was almost bankrupt, especially with a problematic project in Sierra Leone. But General Nice, it's registered in Hong Kong, but basically it grew out of Shanxi, a province which produced coal. So they want to divert their investment and profits from coal mining and looked for other places and came to iron ore. But this company and its managers are on a blacklist, both in Hong Kong and in mainland China. So they're restricted from much financial activity and frozen bank accounts. So it seems that project is not very hopeful either. And finally, another project, but related, I just wanted to say that General Nice is the same company, next slide, that tried to buy the old US naval base in Greenland. Was built in Second World War and very expensive to keep. So Denmark set it to sale. And when the rumor and the interest came from a Chinese company, it was a huge political debate in Denmark. And it's reported that the Danish Prime Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen received pressure from the US. So Denmark said, we're not going to sell it anymore. We'll use it and keep it ourselves, and didn't really directly say no to China, but it was a rebuff from the Danish side. And the last most controversial project is the Greenland rare earth mine. As a byproduct, there would be radioactive uranium and thorium from the project. But as you know, rare earth is very important for the new industries. And Greenland, especially with these mining metals, the purity is very high, but it's just very expensive, logistically very difficult to get there. Australian company called Greenland Minerals has been there for a decade, exploring the site, getting permissions, investing in environmental standards, etc. And they have got really close to getting the final permission. But in April, the Greenlandic general election, this project is the most controversial issue. And actually, it is one of the reasons they have this early election. And the result of that election is that the party that objects to this mine based on environmental concerns won the election. The IA party has since promised to ban the project, and they are making a law to make the permit of radioactivity very low. That would effectively just ban the project. And the Australian company says they will probably sue the Greenlandic government if they really ban the project. And some Greenlanders, they want economic development, they want jobs. A lot of young people are frustrated with their future. But some local communities are worried about environmental implications for the fishermen, for farmers. So it is a controversial issue there. And for the Chinese company that is the biggest stakeholder currently in that mine, of course, it's also a big uncertainty. It came out because also within China, the regulation on capacity, how much they produce, is increasing. Especially now, they say there is a rare earth war in the world, and China needs to have a say in price setting, in controlling the volume of rare earth, and China has been dominating in the supply chain, and 90% of rare earth in the world goes to China for processing before it is sold to the world again. So China wants to keep that. And for this company, which didn't have a big share in China, didn't have the quotas as 5 other groups, it's important to come out to Greenland. Although one of those 5 groups then formed alliance with this provincial level company called Shanhe, then also become a big domestic player too. So in conclusion, in conclusion, I don't know if I have elaborated them, but at least from my report, it shows that these Chinese companies came to Greenland because they have international ambitions, especially domestic reforms are strengthening on environmental standards, on capacity, but they're also becoming more cautious about the high costs, financial risks, and uncertain policy environments. And Chinese private companies, they start out themselves here. It's not started by governments, but later they may form alliance or mixed ownership with state-owned enterprises or get financing from state banks. And there, Chinese state actors would get access to the Greenlandic resources and minings and have more influence. But so far, it seems that these state banks and SOEs have being more cautious than private banks about financial risks. That is also one aspect of China's reform, and especially more stringent requirements on overseas investments. And finally, it seems that it's obvious actually that the US is increasing its financial support for Greenland, and not least because it wants to minimize Chinese presence in Greenland for strategic purposes. And the competition of these two great rivals will continue in Greenland. So far, the US has an upper hand because Denmark is a close ally with the US on strategic matters. And maybe it will continue, and that would put more caution on Chinese private and state actors. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Yang, for that very lucid presentation. I look forward to reading your forthcoming report, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. In 2 weeks' time is our third webinar in this series. We'll be talking a little bit more about the Arctic, but for now, we're going to go a little bit further south and east to Sweden, and Kristina Sandklef is going to give us a little bit of share some of her insights in Sino-Swedish trade. Kristina?
Thank you very much for allowing me to be present at this seminar. So basically, I was asked to talk about the business relations between Sweden and China, and Sweden and China has had really good relations until quite recently. I think this is partly due to the fact that we had an extensive cooperation between Sweden and China approximately 100 years ago, when Sweden was actually helping China to start a geological survey to find minerals and iron ore and coal in order to industrialize the new modern China after the Xinhai Revolution in 1911. This was going on between 1914 and until the late 1920s. And actually, one of the things that came out of that, this scientific cooperation, was actually the Museum of the Far Eastern Antiquities, because while people were looking for doing their geological surveys, they also found archaeological and things that actually ended up as gifts from the Chinese government to Sweden. These good relations, together with the fact that Sweden was a neutral country during the Cold War, and also we had a social democratic government for most of the time, but especially when the People's Republic of China was founded, made Sweden one of the first Western countries recognizing the People's Republic of China. And we were actually the first Western country to set up an embassy and establish diplomatic relations with China in 1950. Basically, so even during the turbulent Mao days with a Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, Sweden had diplomats there, and we had even Swedish Maoists and Chinese students in Chinese visiting China, some of them doing reporting from like Jan Myrdal, who did the report from a Chinese village, for example. And we had the recently passed away Cecilia Lindqvist, a sinologist, who was actually working in China in the early 60s together with her husband, Sven Lindqvist, when he was a cultural attaché. So all these things made a very good mixture for the Swedish business and companies, because we had basically a quite good view of China. China was not like Soviet Union, which was our big enemy, but they were like nice and friendly people. And so when the China opened up when Deng Xiaoping started his economic reforms in 1978, Swedish companies were quite fast on into China. And I believe Bengt Johansson was part of this history. So he should really talk more about that, as he just recently wrote a fantastic book about Swedish companies in China. So basically the first companies that were active in China were active within the industrial sector, especially machinery, mining, energy, infrastructure like telecom. And we could see that Ericsson, where I actually worked many years ago, they were had a big share of the Swedish trade with China. And in the mid-90s, Ericsson was very, very successful in China, and they sold telecom networks, both mobile and fixed line and so on. And in fact, I think that the success in China was so big that there were loads of Swedish expats and so on as well from Ericsson living in China. There were so many that they actually established a Swedish school that was sponsored by Ericsson. It was closed down in, I think it was 2012. Anyway, they really did not see China as anything but a big market where they could sell their telecom, and they didn't see the Chinese competitors like Huawei. I've been present at several meetings where Chinese people have tried, my Chinese colleagues were trying to tell the Swedish Ericsson people who were based in Kista that Huawei was a very big competitor, and they didn't really want to see it because they saw Huawei as a third world country, low technology company that was there's nothing to fear, to quote one very high the Ericsson marketing president in 2005 when he got questions regarding this from African colleagues at Ericsson. And today it's Huawei is very successful and Ericsson is not that successful in China. What we could see is that the Swedish companies, the business environment in China has changed, and so has the Swedish companies. They have become a lot more Sinophised. So there are not as many Swedes working there anymore, but there are many more Chinese business managers because they speak the language, they know how to do business in China. Swedes can't speak Chinese. Well, there are some, but not that many. And so it's become a lot, the market has definitely changed. Also, we have seen that the market has gone from a base for manufacturing cheap goods to become more and more research and development oriented and innovation. And today, I would say that due to the Chinese rapid technological development, a company like Ericsson, they are now very good friends with Huawei because they don't want to be hit by backlashes because Huawei was cut out of the 5G telecom sales here in Sweden. Because China is so advanced now that if you're not in China, you could actually lose out on new technology. So it's important to be in China, not for the size of the market anymore, but for the technology. Currently, there are approximately 600 Swedish companies operating in China, and there are approximately 10,000 Swedish companies engaged in trade with China. And China is the 7th largest trade partner to Sweden. And last year, imports from China were 85 billion Swedish krona and exports were 78 billion krona. Also, it could be interesting to note that Sweden has also received quite a lot of Chinese investments, especially from the Volvo Geely is very important for Sweden. And it's often pointed out as a big success story. Currently, I think they have 23% or something like that of Volvo's sales are in China. And without China and the investments from Geely, Volvo would probably not have existed today, many people say. Sweden being a very open and free trade oriented country, we have not had much of a FDI like restrictions on foreign direct investments. Now we have what the basis of what the EU directive from 2019, what they have, but and we're looking into making new laws on restrictions. Since we are pretty happy-go-lucky and we are pretty naive. This is one of the reasons why 3 out of 3 Swedish semiconductors, 2 of them are currently owned by Chinese dual-use companies. We could also see that because many Swedish companies are very dependent on the Chinese market, In a study that the Swedish daily newspaper Svenska Dagbladet made earlier this year, they found that 16 of the largest Swedish companies that were active in China, they had revenues from China totaling 320 billion Swedish krona. And 5 of them had over 20% of their total revenues from China. And given the current very icy relationship between China and Sweden, Swedish companies are generally at the moment very worried about becoming scapegoats in China, like what happened to the H&M in earlier this spring. H&M had signed the Better Cotton Initiative. They were definitely not alone in doing that. They wrote on their webpage that we do not buy cotton from Xinjiang because of we are not sure if there is forced labor. So we decided not to do it. And suddenly, after the EU had blacklisted 4 Chinese government officials that they claimed were involved in Xinjiang abuses, re-education camps and so on, suddenly H&M became the big scapegoat. They disappeared from the internet, so you couldn't download their apps. You couldn't buy anything from Taobao. You couldn't find them on Chinese interactive maps. And there were people asking Chinese consumers to boycott them because they were not good towards China and so on. And this is something that many other Swedish companies are really scared of becoming similar. So basically, in order to conclude, I would say that many of the Swedish companies are very dependent on China, both for revenues, but also for new technology. And but also these bad relations are impacting them a lot. And with the current discourse in Sweden, where we are more and more talking about abuses of human rights, Xinjiang re-education labor camps, etc., this is becoming my impression is that many Swedish companies are quite scared and they don't really know how to handle the situation because they are dependent on China, but then at the same time, they are being squeezed in between the US, EU, and China trade war, or whatever you would call it, technology war. So, yeah, I will, and I think we will maybe talk later. I mean, you mentioned earlier the comprehensive agreement on investment. Many Swedish companies and European companies were looking forward to that, but it doesn't seem to come true. And we can also see that there are Chinese politics are influencing the market a lot more, especially with dual circulation and Made in China 2025, which are all making China becoming a lot more independent of or self-reliant basically on their own technology and companies. So, yep, I will end here.
Thank you, Kristina. It was a very interesting presentation, as always. And I think now we will continue our journey southward, our conceptual journey southward to Berlin. And David Merkel will share bring a little bit of a German perspective into our discussion. David?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. It's a pleasure also to be part of the discussion today. And also on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I would like to thank you for this opportunity to discuss the Nordic-Chinese relations, to bring in also a little bit of a German perspective. And I would also like to use the opportunity to thank my colleagues, Gabriele Baumann and Richard Vossen, who have been also supporting the publishing of this really precious report of Julian. Yeah, maybe let me start with some remarks. Also listening to Bengt Johansson, who has been based in Shanghai till 2012, and then more or less also started to grow some seeds in terms of the bigger topic, corporate social responsibility, because I started my career with the Adenauer Foundation in the Shanghai office in 2013. And indeed, one of the key topics actually we work on in China also still with our offices is corporate social responsibility as a topic where we have a lot in common, a lot of joint approaches with a lot of Chinese partners. And indeed, it has been especially in the last years, becoming more and more difficult for foreign organizations based in China to actually really push forward and own also value-driven agenda, because we have a huge change, a huge shift in China, especially for everything related to foreign ideas, especially political ideas. But there are still these very important channels, I would say, where we can cooperate. And this is exactly also to bring in the corporate sector from Germany, from Europe, and bring them together with the Chinese side to have also fruitful exchanges. And this is really something we also in our German discussions, of course, observed in the last years, that this kind of what we always also refer to with people-to-people exchange, also this kind of value-driven approach to work together, also on political frameworks where both sides, the European side and the Chinese side, would also have a lot of advantages. Of course, if we bring our different economic system ideas closer together, that there would be a lot of new dynamics and driving forces also to make this whole setting of our relations becoming more fruitful again. And so this is called corporate social responsibility, which is the root for very important corporations. And then a second thing I would like to express here also is, because I have also worked for a Chinese bank in Frankfurt for 2 years, one of the state-owned banks. And what I actually got to know during this time is that we have to also, especially when it comes to the foreign engagement, like the global engagement of Chinese companies, especially state-owned companies, then we also have to use this term corporate national responsibility, because this is exactly how I observed the activities, let's say the mindset of Chinese companies, especially in Frankfurt, because we have this very, very close link between political approaches and economic strategic thinking in China, something for what we really underestimated for a very long time, what Kristina also just referred to. And this was, especially in the context working for a Chinese bank, something very that became actually quite clear. There was a clear picture of how Chinese companies are involved also with the Chinese embassy, with the general consulates, to really have a common agenda. We have Chinese business councils now represented in many of the countries where there's strong engagement from China, where they have a very close coordination mechanism. And that's also something which we really have to keep in our mind, because there's a very strong strategic approach in Chinese engagement. And it's if we are not aware about that, then it's of course very difficult to get our own positions, our own expectations better communicated. So this is something that really frames, I would say, the discussion we have right now as well in Germany about Chinese influence, and also what Kristina just mentioned is growing dependencies because of strong economic engagement. As you know, Germany, for example, the biggest trading partner in 2020 was China, not for the very first time, but it has manifested this kind of position. But it is, we have to specify here, it's in the realm of trade. So it's not in the realm of goods. So it's not in terms of service industries and broader investments. So this is, of course, from a German perspective, the same, that we have China as a very important trading partner. We have thousands of German companies with economic activities in China. Also now we're operating under a framework where it's more and more difficult actually to, if you invest in China, to also get those the money you made out of the country. So there's a kind of more and more forces also on our companies, if you are active in China, that you reinvest there, because it's not as simple anymore. There are no very open financial channels where you can start to, for example, also diversify your own activities. And then we are directly in the middle of our more global and strategic discussions, but we also came to hear about this strong engagement in the Nordic countries, especially when it comes to the Bering Sea, and like from Chinese companies, of course, with a very strategic approach. And from our side, like in the German discussions, this kind of global approach by China is much more on the radar right now, because for many years we have been very much framing our relations with China on a bilateral base. This means everything was based on our economic, of course, also cultural, political relations, with a strong intention also to build trust between the two sides, to have an approach where we also, in spite of all differences of the political systems, of the value systems, that we come to a momentum where we also work together on the bigger global challenges. But as you also see with this global disputes, the strategic competition between the US and China, but more and more also direct confrontations in our bilateral trade relations, for example, it has become a very complex issue to deal with China. And this is something, so we can see this kind of path dependencies, because our economies, our relations have been entangled for many years now, with a very strong engagement on both sides. But, and this is also now a more global approach that's coming from several countries in Europe, and that's also why it's so important also from for Germany and other countries to learn also from the Nordic countries, that we have also an approach to diversify our relations. And this is what we recently, since last year, especially discussed with a new Indo-Pacific. In Germany, we call it guidelines as a German approach, but also now coming from France, from Great Britain, the Netherlands with their own strategies, and now as well also from the European Commission with a new Indo-Pacific strategy. And this should be also the framework where we discuss how we can engage with other countries in this world, not in order to contain China's global engagement, but to be much more prepared, or actually for what we in the recent years saw many cases of this kind of economic embargoes when there were some political disputes arising. We have the Huawei issue in Sweden, of course, where we in Germany also have our experiences. So our domestic discussions on how to deal with critical infrastructure, for example, there are a lot of experiences already that has to bring our approaches also closer together, and to work also on more approaches where we can also diversify our economic relations. And this is something I would like just to bring into this discussion also today, how our approaches can be actually like how we can learn from each other, how we can also find more common ground, and also in what kind of situations our countries also should really strengthen also our positions, because this is something we definitely see in the last couple of days, with also more pressure now on Taiwan from the Chinese side. So there's always, of course, the bigger US-China conflict in the background, but it's more than that. It's also that we need clearer positions from our sides, and also a kind of confidence building to also build our relations with China on a fundament that is also in favor of both sides. Because if we only have like a certain pattern of global engagement by China and a more reactive approach from our countries, there won't be an equilibrium. So it's really important that we learn from all this shifts that which are taking place, and also what Christina referred to very new trends also we see in China, especially in the economic area. But we always have to think it together, politics and economics in the understanding and in the political culture, we have to say, in Chinese decision making, that we will more and more be faced with situations where we have to come up with very clever and clear ways forward. So this would be maybe some first remarks from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And speaking of taking lessons from political culture, ISDP's own Torbjørn Ledin will now tell us a little bit about Sino-Nordic relations from a cultural and from an educational perspective. Torbjørn?
Thank you very much, Julian. I hope that you can all hear me. It's so nice to have this opportunity to cooperate with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. It's a great pleasure for us. I speak on behalf of the ISDP and the Stockholm China Center. It's a great pleasure and it's a privilege really to be able to do this. And linking up with what David just said, I hope that this series of seminars and our report will give us a chance to learn even more from each other's experiences. Perhaps we could play, if only a small part in defining some features of European China strategy. I have been asked by Julian to say a few words about educational and cultural context and exchange between the Nordic countries and China. Now, neither time nor my competence really allows me to say much about anything outside of Sweden. And also looking at the time, I see that we have passed 2 o'clock. How long do you think I could go on, Julian?
5 to 10 minutes is fine, if you could.
Okay. Let me start by perhaps stating the obvious. In a broad historical perspective, which goes back at least 3 centuries, cultural and scholarly contexts really occupy an important position in Sino-Swedish relations. Such exchange has played a not insignificant role even in shaping Swedish consciousness and has been closely intertwined with the political and economic relations, both influencing and reflecting these other forms of relations. In Sweden's case, cultural and educational contexts have a long history that really go back at least more than 300 years. The first Swedish travelogue from China was published in 1667. The first 2 academic dissertations were published in 1694 and 1697. This is much earlier than in the other Nordic countries, especially much earlier than in Norway and Finland, but also earlier in Denmark. So this is perhaps a characteristic feature of Swedish context with China. Protestant Swedish missionaries began to go to China in the 1840s, and they went there in great numbers and really had an impact on aspects of Chinese society that we can still see traces of when we travel in China. In the early 20th century, modern scientific studies of China emerged in Sweden. And I was very happy to hear Kristina say a few words about this, that this was probably very important also for our economic relations and trade relations. And in this, during this epoch from the late 19th century and lasting until the mid 20th century, there were 4 pioneering figures that are highly thought of in China today and which probably have meant their influence, their legacy has played not an insignificant role in paving the way for cooperation in other fields between Sweden and China. The 4 people are the explorer Sven Hedin, with his roots in some sense in Germany. He was a student of Ferdinand von Richthofen. He was a very good friend of Germany, in some ways perhaps too good friend of the German authorities for some time. But he was a very influential scholar, organizing very important projects. Another very important figure was Johan Gunnar Andersson, whom Kristina really mentioned, although not by name, who was invited to China for mine prospecting. but who became so interested in archaeology that he, together with the Chinese professor Li Ji, became the founding father of Chinese ideology. And then we have the sinological pioneer Bernard Colgan, whose work on Chinese, on the Chinese language has been very much recognized and admired by Chinese colleagues. And we have the art historian Oswald Sirén, who made path-breaking studies of the history of Chinese art. Sirén was Finnish by birth, but he did most of his work in Sweden. Swedish missionary activities in China ended with the foundation of the People's Republic of China. And the decision in Sweden to establish diplomatic relations with the People's Republic was welcomed here, especially by leftist intellectuals who wanted to see Sweden pursue an independent political line between the USA and the Soviet Union. This was Sweden representing the third way. And of course, this was an idea that was widely spread, not only among leftist intellectuals. It was also really an idea that was very important to the Swedish government, especially our foreign ministry at that time. And as far as I understand, there was very little opposition to Sweden establishing diplomatic relations with Red China. The Cultural Revolution of China really led to a kind of China craze. Especially leftist intellectuals thought that the Cultural Revolution tackled problems that were also our problems, such as bureaucratization and exaggerated specialization. Mao and the Chinese seemed to be building a new kind of society, and from which we had a lot to learn. And now these ideas soon spread far, in a surprising way, far outside the, after all, rather narrow circle of leftist intellectuals. Even many industrial leaders found Mao's social experiment highly interesting. Of course, these industrial leaders also recognized the potential of the Chinese market for their products. I remember in the early 1970s, I was posted as a young diplomat in Beijing, and I remember how in the autumn of 1973, Prince Bertil of Sweden led a delegation of Swedish industrialists to visit China, and how enthusiastic some of these people were about China when I talked to them. The death of Mao in 1976 and the reorientation of politics in China gave rise to divided opinions about China in Sweden. Some people remained Maoists, but gradually most Maoists gave up their ideas, and the interest in China and in expanding exchange and contact with China remained. The 1989 massacre caused very strong resentment in reactions in Sweden among people of all walks of life, but especially among intellectuals and cultural personalities who tried to pressure our government to restrict our exchange with China. I can even remember from that time how people who represented China officially in Sweden urged us to do what we could to persuade the Swedish government to break diplomatic relations with China. So some of us, I think, really felt that we acted on behalf of Chinese friends when we criticized, and at that time we criticized the Chinese authorities. In the 1990s, these sentiments subsided, these extremely critical sentiments subsided, and it became quite common to think that while we should criticize oppression and violations of human rights in China, we should also promote exchange, because exchange is good by itself. And exchange did increase in tourism, in trade, in education. Scholarly exchange expanded very rapidly. And so from the 1990s, in my perspective at least, to strike a balance between criticism of oppression and violations of human rights on the one hand, and promoting exchange on the other hand, was a key issue, which proved quite difficult. And if Julian will give me time for this, I will share a couple of personal experiences. This has also been from the 1990s. This has been my own personal line, that we should not refrain from voicing criticism, but at the same time we should also promote context and exchange. In the autumn of the year 2000, I invited the then Vice President of Taiwan, Mr. Lien Zhang, to visit Sweden. And I also said officially that, as far, in my opinion, the future of Taiwan, whether Taiwan should become an independent state or not, is not up to me or for us to decide, but I think it is mainly a question for the population of Taiwan to decide. And that made my contacts or friends in the Chinese embassy in Stockholm furious, and they declared that saying this was tantamount to hurting the feelings of the Chinese people. And I was told if I didn't take that back, I would not be able to visit China again. A few years passed, and then I was approached by Chinese officials who told me that let us put our differences aside. We should cooperate after all. Why not set up a Confucius Institute in Stockholm? And so in 2005, we reached an agreement to do so, and I became the director of this institute. Which lasted until 2015. We went on until 2015. And during those 10 years, I think we did good work. Interestingly, the Chinese authorities never put any pressure on us to follow their ideological line. I can remember, for example, how we had once arranged a language competition where one of the competitors gave a talk about Falun Gong, how good Falun Gong was. And this was in the presence of the Chinese ambassador, who looked rather worried, but he didn't protest at all. When Mr. Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Peace Prize, the leadership for the Hanban, the leaders in Beijing, they organized a conference for leaders of Confucius Institutes, to which I was invited. But I was also invited to the prize ceremony in Oslo. And of course, I chose the latter. And I'm sure the Chinese authorities were not happy about this, but they did not openly complain. So I think what they gained from our Confucius Institute was the very fact that it existed here. It was the first Confucius Institute in the Western world. And this was a propaganda gain for the Chinese authorities, but they really treated us very fairly. In 2015, we closed down the institute, mainly because it caused so much suspicion in Sweden, but also because the tide was turning in Beijing. Xi Jinping was in power, and Chinese politics became increasingly authoritarian. And today, looking back at those years that we had the Confucius Institute, those years were really very liberal. How long have I spoken now, Julian? Maybe I should wind up. No,
you could another minute or two.
Okay. Learning Chinese in the 1990s and early 20s, we could almost speak about a craze for learning Chinese. Chinese became a big subject in our secondary schools. Dozens of secondary schools set up courses in Chinese, and students, the number of students who wanted to do Chinese in our university also increased rapidly. Our universities did not have the capacity to receive all students. I was very unhappy about that I felt that we were not flexible enough to receive all those enthusiastic young students who wanted to learn Chinese. But I was happy about the interest. With the deterioration of Sino-Swedish relations, interest in learning the Chinese language, in studying China has receded, has diminished quite a lot. And this is probably inevitable. The Xi Jinping era, and especially since the kidnapping of Gui Minhai in 2015, as you know, he was seized in Thailand and brought to China, to mainland China, to stand trial. After this, and learning more about the appalling oppression going on in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong, and the mainland's behavior towards Taiwan, public opinion in Sweden has become very anti-Chinese government. Today, many people in Sweden, and this has been suggested before, really worried that China poses a threat to us in many ways, and that this calls for great caution when it comes to cooperation and exchange in trade, but also in scholarly cooperation. So the question, to what extent we should continue scholarly cooperation, to what extent should we welcome more Chinese scholars to Sweden, and to what extent should we go there? This is becoming an increasingly controversial question. For me, I think the dilemma that I tried to formulate a while ago remains a key issue. The great challenge for us, as for the rest of Europe, is to stand up for our basic values and criticize oppression and violations of human rights in China, and so on and so forth, while at the same time continue to engage China in various forms of exchange, as long as these do not threaten our security. But how do you do this in practice? This is extremely difficult, and this is something that is really worth thinking about. And it would be wonderful, I think, if our friends from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and also other friends, if we could sit down on different occasions and discuss this. I think I can end on this note. I've already been a bit too long.
Okay, thank you very much, Torbjörn. And speaking of discussion, I'm hoping that we can get the audience to participate. You'll see that you have a question and answer function. We already have collected a few questions, but I thought maybe very quickly I can seize the moderatorial privilege to direct a question at the speakers. And while I'm doing that, maybe I encourage everybody to collect some questions in the Q&A function, which I'll then direct to the discussants in the effort to wrap up by 2:30, which is in 10 minutes. But one thing I feel that perhaps we could discuss a little bit is the comprehensive agreement on investment, which Bengt and Kristina and also David, all of you have touched upon briefly. I was wondering if you could share some of your views on the potential impacts that the CAI, the CAI, might have on Sino-Nordic relations, and whether this might have applications in other areas, whether this could engender social change in China, the Nordics, or Europe more broadly. Does this have an application for climate governance and efforts to transform our economies and societies to being more green and sustainable? So if anybody would like to pick up on those questions. Bengt, perhaps?
Well, I think I mentioned that as the ratification has been stalled, we do not think so much of what the content is. But if you go back, the whole thing was an attempt to put us on the same page as US companies. Because US had, of course, with the phase one deal, achieved market access that was much higher than they had before. And now, if EU companies will not have a similar market access, this will be problematic. So I would recommend you to look at the EUCCC website. The EUCCC is the European Chamber of Commerce, and everything the EU Commission does. And I worked with this in the EU Commission, so I know they listen to the EUCCC and their position papers. This is actually the only interpretation I can do. I think that our companies would stand to gain a lot if CAI was implemented, but I also think that we can never convince China to join these ILO conventions on our own. Therefore, we have a dilemma. What is most important for us? And today, I think the most important thing for the peoples in Europe is that this is done correctly and that China should join the ILO. The Swedish Prime Minister, of course, who is a trade union veteran, he said immediately, of course, China has to follow ILO. But our Swedish Foreign Minister did not say anything. The Trade Minister didn't say anything. So we of course, have the position then of being a bit muted on this question until we see what happens in the EU.
Mm-hmm. Did anyone else have anything to add? No? All right, then what we'll do is we'll jump right into the Q&A questions. Some of these are very long, so I'm going to try to summarize them. I'll direct the questions at each of you, and then we'll kind of go one by one, okay? So let me just read down these questions. Adam Stepien of the University of Lapland has a question for you, Dr. Yang. What is your assessment of the influence of Chinese governmental policies on the private corporate decision-making? Is the Chinese government effectively determining overseas investment decisions, or to what extent is it influential? Are economic considerations maybe in the end all that matter? What are the mechanisms of governmental influence? So that's for you, Dr. Yang. I'll give you a second to think about that. Elizabeth Ferreira Bolin has a question for you, David. China's current behavior towards countries in the South China Sea area, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and its foothold in Africa indicate that it is clear that China is steadily creeping towards being able to project its control worldwide. How would you weigh Germany's economic advantages and gains in the short run with its present relationship with Germany against political gains of China in the future? For Christina, we have a question. You mentioned that Swedish businesses are increasingly wary of diplomatic tensions and human rights abuses, while also feeling that they have to be present in China to gain know-how and stay competitive. Do you see any gradual changes in how they try to navigate these tensions? Yes, I think we'll leave it at that for now. So would anybody like to go first?
Yeah, I can take it because I got the first question. It's a good question because you can't say that all Chinese private companies have autonomy in doing business. They're not state-owned, therefore they're not influenced by the state. And indeed, also an earlier speaker also mentioned that Chinese state-owned enterprises also have to integrate China's political mission, their own political missions and policy missions within their business model. They don't necessarily prioritize policy objectives every time, but among Chinese private companies, it depends on how big you are, which sector you are. For example, a company like Huawei, it is like one of China's flagship companies, and of course they have lots of close government contact, and the government would like to use it as a kind of diplomatic tool. And the company also relies on Chinese government and diplomacy for expanding global business. For companies in mining, construction sectors, private companies within China, they need to have good relations with the government in order to have a market proportion and also to get financing. A lot of initiatives they take overseas are from themselves, but maybe during the process, they will need support from the Chinese government. It doesn't mean the government would direct how they develop their business, but if they cross a red line, the government will come, if the government has the information, will come and say that, you know, this hurts national interest, be it the Chinese image or too bad competition for state-owned enterprises or leaking important information, like the case of some IT companies that tries to go listed in the US. Then the government will tries to regulate them. So most of them have their own initiatives, but they also have and they also have lots of autonomy. But if they step over the red line, they would be, you know, the government would try to bring them back. And a lot of times the government is not very aware and don't know so much about how much is invested, which companies are invested. So owning the big ones are inside, I would say.
Okay, thank you. David, could we go to you next quickly?
Sure, yeah. So what can we do actually, or what would be our advantage also? And I don't think of only like a German let's say foreign economic approach. It really has to be to bring our strengths and skills together, because a lot of countries also have doubts, especially the societies have doubt about the long-term effects of Chinese investment. And it's not that all of those examples I refer to have a really strategic intention, but of course we have to see this geopolitical and geostrategic approach by China, and that's also what more and more societies also are very much aware of. So it's more about political elites, economic leaders who also based on their own interests try to promote like bigger projects, large-scale projects with short-term effects, because there's also reliability in terms of if you get re-elected, for example, or if you want to get re-elected, that you want to show some well-functioning projects. But it's really also about the long-term financial impact for the countries, especially in Africa. We see many countries with huge debts that has increased, especially now during the COVID crisis. Dependencies were growing, and so there have to be more practical alternatives also from European stakeholders. Also German companies are very much also involved in many countries, but sometimes they just don't have the opportunity to provide services for the same price as a Chinese company would do. And I think we will see a lot of change in that, because we also see that the foreign currency reserves of China are shrinking. Then we have this huge debt also of state-owned as well as private companies in China. So it's not as easy anymore to fund big projects abroad. So I think there will be a lot of new thinking be necessary for all parties involved in Belt and Road initiatives. And as you maybe just heard also, you found a new narrative or a new name also for the European connectivity approach, now called the Global Gateway approach. And I think we have much more, or a better framework actually also now to coordinate better among European companies. And this is something that we really have to work on, because a lot of people worldwide are waiting for better communicated and better coordinated European approaches.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, David. And then finally, Christina.
Okay, so basically, because we're running out of time, I will be very quick here. So basically, my impression is that Swedish companies are, because many of the Swedish companies are actually the ones based in China are run by Chinese people, so maybe they don't have the same kind of information or the same values as Swedish people who are very much pro human rights and so on. To them, maybe what is happening in Xinjiang, they're not really aware of everything. So for that reason, I think they are mainly adapting. And this is a problem for the Swedish companies with the headquarters, because they also have to listen to what their Chinese colleagues are saying back in China. And so basically my impression is that they are trying to adapt quite a lot, and but they also, because they want to stay in China, because China is a big market and they have the technology development there, which we really need to know, because I mean, before, like in the 80s, what happened in China mainly stayed in China. Nowadays, what happens in China goes abroad. So you will end up getting Chinese competitors that could beat you on in your neighborhood, basically, just like Ericsson experienced with Huawei. So my impression is that they are laying low a little bit, but they are also trying to become more educated on what is really going on, and try to avoid like teasing the big panda so that the dragon won't get too angry with them. So that's my impression, but it is a very hard, it's a tricky, and some companies I'm sure are also thinking maybe we shouldn't be in China. Maybe we should leave because this country is going too far. the government is going too far, we can't stay. But yeah, so that's my impression.
Okay, thank you, Christina. And thanks to all of our great speakers. It's been really wonderful having you here. I think at these webinars, it always becomes very clear that there's so much to discuss. We could go on and on and on for a very long time. And we have unfortunately run out of time for today, but the discussion continues. We'll have another webinar together with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in 2 weeks' time, this time zooming in a little bit on the Arctic. So I'm hoping that there we can dive in a little bit more on some of the aspects of Sino-Nordic relations. So I look forward to that, and I look forward to welcoming today's discussants as participants and attendees, and some of our attendees online today to that event as well. Also, I should say, once our report is out, please read it. It'll be shared on our website, and we'll be sure to circulate it to all of you. And the discussion continues. So I hope to see all of you again soon. I'm Julian Tucker. It's been a pleasure having you here with us today. Bye.